People, what's the most awkward or bizarre family moment you've experienced? I walked in on my aunt being intimate with someone who's not her husband in my grandma's bed at my grandpa's funeral. I was going through an incredibly difficult day. My grandpa had just passed, and it was a time of mourning for our whole family. We were all gathered at my grandma's house, trying to support each other through the loss. It was a heavy, somber atmosphere, with everyone grieving in their own way. I went upstairs to check on something and, to my complete shock, walked into a situation I never expected. There, in my grandma's room, I found my aunt in an intimate situation with someone who definitely wasn't her husband. It took a moment for it to even register. I was immediately overwhelmed by the awkwardness of it all, especially considering the timing and the location. My grandpa had just passed, and this was happening in my grandma's bed, of all places. Story 2. About 17 or 18 years ago, my uncle had an affair with my aunt's brother's wife. The only people who know about it, aside from the 4 directly involved, are me and my eldest cousin, because my aunt drunkenly confessed it to us at a family reunion. Everyone else believes that the 2 families simply dislike each other for some trivial reason. What's even more complicated is that my aunt has a son who's about to turn 18, and he doesn't look anything like his dad but bears a striking resemblance to my other uncle. Despite this, no one has ever brought it up, and we've never mentioned it. Story 3. Many years ago, on Thanksgiving, my mom decided that we should go around the table and share what we were thankful for before eating. Despite my dad repeatedly saying that he didn't want to do it and that it wasn't a great idea, she insisted. So, we all sat around the table, waiting to see what would happen. Everyone was there, my siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, and my grandmother. My dad volunteered to go first, and you could see on my mom's face that she wasn't sure whether she should be concerned about what he might say or if he was just going along with it. My dad said, "I'm thankful that at 50 years old, I can still raise the flagpole if you know what I mean." The reaction was split. Half the table couldn't stop laughing, while the other half was awkwardly uncomfortable. My mom was furious, and my dad got exactly what he wanted. The whole thing ended right there, and we moved on to dinner. Story 4. One year at our extended family's Christmas party, my aunt was excited to show everyone a video she had taken on their recent vacation. She had been talking about it for weeks, so the whole family gathered around to watch it. We popped in the VHS tape, expecting to see beautiful vacation memories. But to everyone's surprise, the video didn't start with the vacation footage. Instead, it suddenly cut to a video of my 20-year-old cousin, her son, at a house party. The video showed a group of girls flashing. Apparently, while my aunt was away on a work trip, my cousin threw a party at the house and, in the process, accidentally taped over the family vacation video with footage from the party. There we were, about 20 family members, all awkwardly watching what could only be described as my cousin's personal party video. It was incredibly uncomfortable, and everyone was shocked by what had just played. My cousin's face turned bright red as he realized what had happened, and he quickly understood that there was no way to escape the embarrassment. Needless to say, he ended up in a lot of trouble for that one. Story 5. After my mom donated a kidney to me, we were both recovering in the hospital. She really wanted to see me, but the hospital wouldn't let her because she was still dealing with complications from her surgery and was out of it. Somehow, though, she managed to slip out of her room and find me. Mind you, I was on a completely different floor, so I have no idea how she did it. It was my first day eating solid foods, and I was really looking forward to it. But then, in walks my mom. For some reason, she thought it was the perfect time to undress, full frontal, and yes, she didn't hold back. She says, "Michael, look at what they did to me. Look at these scars." Let's just say, I can never eat Fruit Loops again without being reminded of that moment. Story 6. This didn't happen to me, but it did happen to my cousin, who has a bit of a drinking problem. She was staying at our grandparents' house for a local festival, and things got a little out of hand. She ended up getting completely hammered drunk and decided to walk home. When she got back to the house, she went straight for the bathroom, got undressed, and then crawled into bed. The issue was, she wasn't in the room she was supposed to be sleeping in. Instead, she ended up in my grandparents' bedroom, completely bare, and crawled into bed next to my grandfather. Imagine the surprise when my grandfather woke up to find her in bed with him, not realizing how she had ended up there. It was definitely an awkward situation for everyone involved. Story 7. When I was in high school, I was at my first real girlfriend's house, and we would often spend time in the finished basement when her family was around to avoid any interruptions. After we were done, it became a habit to tie up the rubber to keep it hidden, so her mom wouldn't find it while cleaning. I would leave it on top of the ping pong table, planning to take it upstairs later when we left. The ping pong table was right next to the couch, so it seemed like a convenient spot. One day, I made a mistake. Her dad and younger brother decided to go downstairs to play ping pong. The brother got to the table first, noticed it, and picked it up. He held it out in front of him and asked, "Dad, what is this?" The dad's face went pale, and in a panic, he grabbed his son's wrist, screamed at him to drop it, and stomped upstairs, all while glaring at me. That moment definitely left a lasting impression. It seemed to instill a real fear of birth control for my girlfriend, and years later, she ended up pregnant in college by a man much older than her. Story 8. My grandfather has always been a difficult person to deal with. My dad has 5 siblings, and he's the second youngest. When I was 24 years old, I was talking to my cousin and found out something that completely shocked me. It turns out, when my dad's mother, my grandmother, was pregnant with him, my grandfather had an affair. He cheated on her with her own sister, and as a result, she also became pregnant. So, my dad's younger sibling is actually his half-brother. What made it even more complicated is that my grandmother and her sister lived with my grandfather. I had always been told that my grandmother's sister never married and just lived with them, which, where I'm from, isn't all that unusual. Since I didn't spend much time at my grandparents' house, it never really seemed like a big deal to me. Here's the part that really threw me off. Because of the affair, my grandmother's sister wasn't able to marry anyone else, especially in the social climate at the time. So, as strange as it sounds, they arranged for her to marry my grandfather as well. All 3 of them, my grandfather, my grandmother, and her sister, have lived together into their 80s now. And from what I've learned, even today, my grandfather continues to maintain separate relationships with each of them, one sleeping in a room while the other is in a different room next door. I grew up completely unaware of any of this. Even now, I don't think my parents know that I know what I found out. When my cousin shared all of this with me, I couldn't believe it. It was a complete revelation. Story 9. I was back in town visiting my family, and I met up with my dad and stepmom. They were out drinking with some of our closest family friends. After a little while, I noticed they were getting pretty drunk and rowdy. The women, including my stepmom, started becoming more flirtatious with each other. There were 5 couples, including my parents, at this gathering, and I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable watching all these people I grew up around being so openly flirtatious in public. It started to get overwhelming, so I finally asked my parents, "What is going on here?" My stepmom, laughing and clearly intoxicated, responded, "To be honest, you're the only one in this room I haven't been with." At that point, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Story 10. When I was a kid, the PlayStation was kept in my parents' room, and my little brother and I would usually go in there to play Gran Turismo. Our favorite thing to do was race the Suzuki Escudo at full speed, never using the brakes, and somehow still finishing a lap ahead of everyone else. One day, my brother got frustrated about something and threw his controller in anger. The controller disconnected from the console and ended up landing on top of my parents' wardrobe. We were small, so we decided to climb up to get it. In the process, we knocked over a lot of items on the wardrobe, making a mess. At one point, I felt something soft hit my forehead. It looked like a strange object, something big and unusual. My brother picked it up, and I took it from him. To my surprise, it seemed like it was a piece of plastic that resembled a body part. I innocently thought it might be a part of a mannequin or something similar because I had never seen a mannequin without clothes and assumed they must have certain features. Without thinking too much about it, I instinctively tossed it back up onto the wardrobe. But by this point, my brother had already rushed downstairs to tell my parents we had found something strange in their bedroom. My parents quickly came upstairs, asking what we had found. I explained that it looked like a strange plastic object, something like a part of a toy. Since that day, the PlayStation has stayed in our room. Story 11. My uncle's new wife was meeting the family for the first time at a gathering. After a glass of wine, she asked if she could be herself, and everyone agreed. Then, out of nowhere, she asked my 71-year-old grandfather if he sat at home watching TV and playing his pickle all day. Just to clarify, this was the first time we'd had her at a family function. We had briefly met her at their wedding, but no one really knew much about her. We later found out that, after we had left their wedding, she had started a brawl, and as a result, my family was no longer welcome at the American Legion. Story 12. I moved back home after my freshman year of college and had to share a room with my high school-age brother for a while. Every night before he went to sleep, I had to listen to him, well, take care of himself. It was pretty uncomfortable to hear, but I didn't know what to do about it. Just to clarify for those asking why I didn't say something to him, he always wore headphones while doing his thing. I didn't really want to go up to him and awkwardly say, "Hey, can you stop?" In hindsight, I probably should have worn headphones myself, but fortunately, my mom ended up kicking him out before the summer ended due to some issues, so it wasn't a long-term problem. Also, we were on opposite sides of the room with a tall dresser between us, so there wasn't a direct line of sight. I could only hear it, and there's really no mistaking that sound. Story 13. Many years ago, I was house-sitting for my grandparents, and while I was tidying up, I went to change the sheets. When I lifted the first sheet, to my surprise, there was my grandmother's toy. I wasn't sure what to do with the discovery, so I just kept it to myself for years, not really knowing how to bring it up. Eventually, I did tell my mom about it, and her only reaction was, "Your grandfather is impotent." At the time, I was a little weirded out, not sure how to process the whole thing. But looking back now, I just laugh about it. For those wondering, my mom's comment about impotency wasn't because of something that had been true his whole life. He was not always impotent. It was something that happened as he got older. Also, just to clarify, he is not my biological grandfather, but he has been a grandfather figure to me, so I consider him my grandfather nonetheless. Story 14. When I was 18, I started dating a girl who lived about an hour away. Because of the distance, I would stay overnight at her house, but her parents didn't allow us to stay in the same room, so I would sleep in a guest bed in the basement. Being 18, we often stayed up late, usually going to bed around 2 a.m. Her dad worked as a delivery driver and had early shifts, starting around 4 a.m. Every morning, without fail, he would come down to the basement before work and, in a private space, engage in personal activities on the desktop computer, just 10 feet away from me. There was only a couch separating us, so the first few times I heard sounds, I would peek my head out from under the blanket to figure out what was going on. After realizing what was happening, I just kept quiet about it, but I didn't let it slide. I eventually decided I couldn't keep this to myself and started texting my girlfriend discreetly, saying things like, "Your dad's at it again right next to me." It was an awkward situation, to say the least, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. Story 15. When I was much younger, I'm 29 now, my parents invited a few people over for a gathering, including my aunt and uncle, who were incredibly straight-laced and always so proper. Early in the evening, while things were still pretty quiet and everyone was just chatting, my aunt brought out a VHS tape she had found. She said it was a movie she remembered watching years ago during a trip she took with my uncle. Nothing had really started to happen yet with the gathering, so some of us decided to stick around to watch the movie, curious to see what it was. As soon as the movie started, we were all in for a shock. Within the first 5 minutes, there were scenes dressed like Adam and Eve than you'd see in your average late-night cable movie. My aunt was absolutely mortified, looking at the screen and saying she didn't remember any of this. Meanwhile, my mom, her sister, was in hysterics, laughing uncontrollably. She snatched the remote from my aunt and insisted that they leave it on because the whole situation was so ridiculous, and my aunt's reaction was just too funny to miss. I distinctly remember my mom saying, "How the hell could you not remember any of this? There are so many bouncing melons on the screen. I can't even see the plot." At this point, the whole room was in tears from laughing. My aunt had essentially brought over a softcore 80s film, with a random subplot involving skiing thrown in there sporadically. It was so bizarre that no one could stop laughing, especially since my aunt had no idea what kind of movie she brought. Then my dad walked in, probably hearing the laughter from the other room. As soon as he saw what was on the screen, his face just dropped, and he turned around without saying a word. He made a beeline for the kitchen and poured himself a drink, clearly not wanting to be a part of this awkward moment. Story 16. I used to skip school a lot when I was younger, mainly because my dad worked long hours, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, and he was a single parent. So, I often stayed in my room, enjoying the peace and quiet while he was at work. One day, though, he came home early, and I wasn't prepared for it. Panicking, I froze, not wanting to get caught skipping school. My room was at the top of the stairs, and the computer was positioned right at the base of the stairs, so I had to be extra careful. To my surprise, my dad sat down at the computer and started watching an adult movie for the next hour. I tried to stay as still and quiet as possible, hoping he wouldn't notice me. At one point, I think he heard a small squeak from my room. He called up the stairs to check if I was there, but I didn't move or say anything. I just stayed still, holding my breath. After a few minutes, he must have been satisfied that everything was fine, and he went back to his routine without any further questions. That moment stayed with me for a long time, and I never told him about it. I also never skipped school again after that day. It was an awkward experience that made me rethink my choices. Story 17. The morning after my wedding, I was in the hotel lobby, still processing the whirlwind of emotions from the day before. I was grabbing a cup of coffee when I unexpectedly ran into my cousin. She looked a little flushed and seemed to have something on her mind. We started chatting, and out of nowhere, she asked about one of my groomsmen. She seemed curious and wanted to know how he was related to me. I told her he was just a friend of mine, someone I'd known for years. When I told her that, she seemed almost disappointed, her face falling a little. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I assumed maybe she was just tired from the festivities the night before or was still processing the excitement of the wedding. It wasn't until later that I found out the real reason behind her odd reaction. Apparently, after the wedding reception, she had cheated on her new husband with the very groomsman I'd introduced her to. Turns out, my cousin had hoped that the groomsman and I were actually related, thinking maybe there was some kind of twisted family connection that could justify what had happened. She was genuinely bummed when she found out that he wasn't her cousin or something that could make their brief encounter less scandalous. Story 18. Back when I was in school, I had a girlfriend at the time, and we were hanging out in my room, getting intimate. Out of nowhere, the door to my room started to open very slowly and silently, almost like a scene from a movie. To my absolute horror, my dad walked in. He saw me, saw her, and we shared the most awkward eye contact ever. My mind raced, and I had no idea what to do at that moment. In sheer panic, I pointed toward the door, motioning for him to leave, and just as quietly as he had entered, he left. Ever since that day, I've had a bit more respect for him. My girlfriend still has no idea what happened. Story 19. I was helping my then-boyfriend's sister move into a new place, and we needed to get the keys. So, my boyfriend and I drove over to pick them up. While we were there, we decided to take a little tour of the empty house to check things out. We discovered there was an attic and opened the ceiling door to let down the ladder. I climbed up first, and since I was wearing a skirt, let's just say I might have unintentionally given my boyfriend a bit of a view. In the midst of our exploring, we ended up getting a little too caught up in the moment, and, well, right then, we heard the door open. We heard my boyfriend's name called out, followed by a brief pause, and then the door shut. Feeling a bit embarrassed, we headed back to the old house, where we found his sister trying not to burst into laughter. She told us their mom had come over to check on things, and when she returned, she just blurted out, they were shagging. To this day, whenever something awkward happens, that phrase always makes us laugh. It's become a bit of an inside joke. Story 20. I was in the middle of banging my girlfriend when I suddenly felt a sharp cramp in the muscle just beneath my jaw, the one right under the tongue. It hit me so unexpectedly and painfully that I had to stop what I was doing immediately. I ended up falling to the floor, trying to massage the muscle in an attempt to relieve the pain. It was excruciating. My girlfriend, who had been really close to finishing, was understandably frustrated. But when she saw me in pain, she tried to help me out. At that moment, we were both sitting in my living room, half-dressed, trying to figure out what to do next. And then, as if on cue, the front door opened. To my horror, my parents, younger brother, and a few of my teenage cousins walked in unexpectedly. They had decided to drop by without any prior notice and didn't bother knocking first. My dad was the first to enter, and the sight that greeted him was less than ideal. I'm sure you can imagine how awkward and embarrassing it was for all of us. Story 21. I stayed at my girlfriend's parents' house for Christmas, and their family woke up to 2 turds in their hallway and 2 turds of my crap in their toilet still. A few years ago, I was dating my ex-girlfriend, and it was around Christmas time. I had been with her for a few months and was invited to her family's house for Christmas Eve. The plan was to spend the night, open presents, and have breakfast together on Christmas morning. This was my first real adult relationship, and to be honest, I was pretty nervous about meeting her family, especially since I had just had a kidney transplant about 4 months prior. We arrived around noon, and everyone started preparing spaghetti for dinner that night. I was relieved to have a task to focus on. It helped distract me from my nerves. After I finished my part in the cooking, I decided to calm my anxiety with a bit of alcohol, which turned into me drinking more than I should have. Since I just had a transplant, my tolerance was low, and I ended up getting way too drunk. The party was fun, and I ended up making some new friends and sharing plenty of laughs, but unfortunately, I blacked out toward the end of the night. Her sister later told me about some of the things I did while I was out of it. Apparently, she saw me in Dad's office, laughing uncontrollably at the paper shredder. At one point, I was in the hallway, singing show tunes, and I even ran outside in the cold December air, barefoot and shirtless, in the middle of the night. Keep in mind, it was freezing where we were, so I was making questionable decisions all around. The worst part of the night came after everyone had gone to bed. I was still awake, wandering around. The next thing I knew, I woke up to my girlfriend yelling at me on Christmas morning. She stood over me, asking, Did you do something in the hallway last night? I was still groggy, so all I could muster was, no. But she wasn't having it. She replied, I bet you did, and immediately went into detective mode. She pulled my pants down to check, and much to my horror, I had cookie bottom, a telltale sign of what had happened. It was one of the most embarrassing moments of my life, and definitely not the Christmas memory I had hoped for. Story 22. When I was 19, my uncle started dating a woman who had a daughter from a previous marriage. The daughter and I had a brief romantic relationship that included physical intimacy. Eventually, we went our separate ways, but later, my uncle married her mother, making us step-cousins. This all happened about 10 years ago. I mentioned that to set the stage for what happened at Thanksgiving last year. Thanksgiving is the one event where the entire family gathers, and my step-cousin's husband was there. Throughout the evening, he made several snide comments about my girlfriend and me. I had a few drinks and, after enduring his behavior all night, I finally lost my temper. I turned around and yelled in his face, My dong has been in your wife and she frigging loves it. Everyone at the table heard me. He stormed out, leaving his wife, my step-cousin, in tears. At the time, I felt like I'd gotten the last word, but the fallout was significant. I haven't spoken to my uncle, aunt, or most of the extended family since. Now I'm bracing myself for this year's Thanksgiving. Story 23. Until I was about 18, I was scared of sleeping alone. I'd often wake up in the middle of the night, grab my pillow and blanket, and quietly set up a spot on the floor next to my parents' bed. Most of the time, they wouldn't even notice I was there until morning. One night, as usual, I went into their room around midnight and fell asleep on the floor. A few hours later, I woke up to some noises and realized my parents were having an intimate moment. Out of reflex, I lifted my head, and my mom noticed me. For a few seconds, we made eye contact before she let out a startled scream and rushed out of the room. I immediately laid back down and pretended to be asleep, wishing I could disappear. This was never spoken of. Story 24. One afternoon, my family and I were casually sitting around the kitchen table, chatting and enjoying each other's company. Suddenly, I heard a faint buzzing noise coming from somewhere in the room. I tilted my head slightly and asked if anyone else could hear it. The moment the question left my lips, the room fell into an uneasy silence, and we all exchanged confused glances, wondering what in the world that noise could be. For almost 10 minutes, everyone was frantically searching around the house, trying to locate the source of the strange sound. It was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. But as time passed, it suddenly clicked in my mind. I realized what the noise was. My toy, buried in the bottom of my backpack, was buzzing against the hard floor. My heart sank. By this point, my whole family had gotten involved in the search, and there was no escaping the situation. The buzzing had already gone on for too long. I knew I had no choice but to pick up my bag, turn off the device, and face the music. I reluctantly revealed to everyone what the noise had actually been, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over me. What made the whole ordeal even more awkward was that I had never even used the thing. It had been a gift from my boyfriend at the time, and now, to my horror, my entire family knew I owned such a personal item. It was one of those moments where I couldn't help but wish the ground would just swallow me up. Story 25. During a family vacation in Costa Rica, my mother, father, and sister traveled with my maternal grandfather, who had recently lost his wife a few months prior. My sister was in her 20s at the time and had been assigned to share a room with my grandfather. One night, he made an inappropriate request that my sister promptly rejected. Thankfully, he did not bring it up again after that. To provide some context, this was not an unfamiliar relative. He had been a part of my sister's life since her birth. In retrospect, we've since learned that my grandfather was beginning to show signs of dementia, which can sometimes cause confusion and erratic behaviors that are not entirely unusual in such situations. What made it even more challenging, however, were my parents' reactions when they were informed of what had occurred. My father seemed more preoccupied with his discomfort from the heat and the insects around them than with the gravity of the situation. My mother, attempting to rationalize the event, suggested that it was simply because her father was grieving the loss of his wife. This led to further concerns. Over time, we began to wonder if my mother might have experienced similar issues with her father when she was younger, as her response seemed to reflect an unsettling level of normalization of his behavior. Story 26. I first met my future wife back in 2007, and the following summer, her grandparents moved to town. On July 4, 2008, I was doing what I usually did for the holiday, grabbing a bottle of Jameson, heading over to a friend's house, swimming in the pool, getting thoroughly intoxicated, and enjoying grilled hot dogs and hamburgers throughout the day. Around 2 p.m., my girlfriend, who would later become my wife, showed up and asked if I was ready to go. It turned out she had already made plans to leave work early and visit her grandparents' house for a meal, where I was supposed to meet them for the first time. In the chaos of my day, I had completely forgotten about this. At that point, I had already consumed quite a bit of alcohol, but I managed to pull myself together and agreed to go with her. When we arrived, her grandfather greeted me with a shot of 149 proof whiskey and a Coors Light. I continued to drink throughout the day, which led to things quickly spiraling out of control. From what I've been told, since my memory is hazy from that time, sometime during the afternoon, I decided to relieve myself off the back porch. It was broad daylight, and we were in a suburban neighborhood. At that point, I could barely stand, so I leaned on whatever was nearby to maintain my balance. Unfortunately, that happened to be a grill that had been cooking for hours. Her grandmother, who was closest to the door, heard the commotion and came outside to find me on the deck, completely unaware of my surroundings, and I was quite vocal about how hot the grill was as I attempted to steady myself. Needless to say, it was not the best first impression. In a surprising turn, her grandmother ended up telling this story at our wedding. In hindsight, they were really understanding about the whole situation, but it certainly wasn't the most graceful way to meet my future wife's grandparents. Story 27. During high school, I would occasionally skip classes to spend time with my then-girlfriend while my parents were at work. Our house was conveniently close to the school, so it seemed like a good opportunity to hang out. On one particular day, we were spending time together as usual when I suddenly heard a knock at the front door. The door was locked, and I had carelessly left the keys in the door. At first, I thought it was just an older relative, an uncle who sometimes visited us in the mornings. I figured he would leave after a few moments, so I didn't think much of it and continued what we were doing. However, the knocking grew louder and more persistent. After a while, I heard it at the window as well. At that point, I realized it was my dad. Panic set in. We scrambled to get dressed, tidied up the bed, and I started brainstorming some excuses. The best I could come up with was that we were studying geography, and I had been so focused that I didn't hear the knocks because I needed to use the bathroom. When I opened the door, there stood my dad, clearly upset, and my mom with a foot in a cast. She had broken her foot at work and had to go to the hospital. When she came home, she found the door locked, which led to an unexpected confrontation. Needless to say, they didn't buy my story about studying geography, and the situation definitely didn't go as planned. Story 28. Every Christmas Eve, our family gathers to play the traditional game of White Elephant, and without fail, there's always at least one gift that's reserved for the 21-plus crowd. The kids always get really excited and try to grab a small box placed under the tree by my aunt and uncle, and every time they see the 21 and over tag on it, they act like they've just found treasure, their enthusiasm, through the roof. One year, it was my turn to pick a gift, and curiosity got the best of me. I chose the small package, thinking it might just be a cute little bottle of liquor or some other grown-up gift. I should mention that I was sitting between my mom and grandma as I opened the gift. When I unwrapped it, I was surprised to find it wasn't what I expected. Instead of something like a bottle of spirits, it was an adult toy. As soon as the adults saw what I had opened, they burst into laughter. Quickly, we hid it from view to make sure the younger ones didn't find out. But, of course, the kids were curious and immediately set off on a mission to find out what had caused all the laughter. The night quickly turned into a kind of family-wide game of hide the item, with everyone passing it around from drawer to cabinet, to different spots in the kitchen, and even hiding it in crock pots and on shelves. It became an ongoing inside joke for the rest of the evening. Story 29. When I was in high school, my family lived in a small apartment. It was cozy but not spacious, and as my sister got older, she took over the spare room as her bedroom. Since there wasn't much room to spare, I shared a bedroom with my parents. During this time, my sister started working full-time, and my mom was at her job as well. My dad, who worked as a driver for a transportation company, had a fluctuating schedule, depending on when his company needed him for trips to places like JFK or LaGuardia. One day, I had a girlfriend over, and we were hanging out in my room. Given the circumstances, we had some private time, and things were progressing until suddenly, I heard the front door of the apartment open. It caught me off guard, and with nerves setting in, I froze for a second. But before I could really think, I realized I had to act quickly. Unfortunately, in the rush, I didn't have time to stop what was happening. My dad, who had come home unexpectedly, was just about to enter my room. The door didn't have a lock at the time, so I instinctively jumped up, rushing to shut the door before he could come in. I shouted out to him, "I'm changing, don't come in," trying to cover the awkwardness of the moment. Fortunately, my dad had come home for a very different reason. He needed to use the bathroom. He mentioned this quickly and went into the bathroom. My girlfriend, who was equally surprised, quickly got dressed and ran out of the apartment, trying to avoid the situation entirely. I quickly put on my clothes, grabbed my shoes, and told my dad I was heading out to grab something to eat. I didn't stick around to hear his response. I just made sure everything was in order, discarded the evidence, and rushed out of the apartment, thankful that things hadn't gotten worse. Story 30. It happened not too long ago. My boyfriend and I were finally home alone, and, well, let's just say things got a little romantic. I tend to be a bit vocal when we're alone at home, and I didn't think much of it at the time. The problem started when his brother and his fiancée came downstairs. They live upstairs, but they've been using our kitchen while they're still working on getting their own setup. We didn't hear them come down, and I was, let's say, in the middle of being pretty expressive with my boyfriend. The house was completely silent, so naturally, things were a bit intense. We finished up, and I went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, only to walk right into his brother and his fiancée standing there. I froze. The first thing I did was say hello, but they immediately burst out laughing. I was so confused, thinking, what are they laughing at? I couldn't imagine it was because of what they'd heard. Maybe something was wrong with my face, I thought. Sure enough, when I looked in the mirror, I saw what had happened. My bright red lipstick was smeared all over my face. I looked like I had just walked out of a comic book. Without thinking, I blurted out, well, that happened thanks to your brother, and they just started laughing even harder. I couldn't help but laugh along because the situation was just so ridiculous. Story 31. At the age of 25, I found myself facing a difficult time. I had lost my job and apartment, and suddenly, I was back at my parents' house, living with them again. After a few weeks of adjusting to this new situation, I met a woman through an online dating site, either Plenty of Fish or OkCupid, one of those. We had been talking for a while, and since we were both going through tough times, me job hunting and her navigating a divorce, we decided on a simple, low-cost first date. We ended up having a great time, staying out until around 1:30 or 2 in the morning. I came back to my parents' house, trying to be as quiet as possible to avoid waking anyone. I carefully turned on the alarm for the door and tiptoed down the hallway. However, as I passed by my parents' bedroom, I noticed the door was wide open. To my shock, I inadvertently saw and heard a lot more than I expected. It was an awkward and uncomfortable moment, and I quickly tried to move past it, but it definitely left me a bit rattled. By the next week, I had secured a new job, and I was able to move out of my parents' house in just a week and a half. It wasn't the best way to end my stay, but it certainly pushed me to get back on my feet quickly. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.